In the lonely expanse, where the dusty wind scoured every inch of the frontier, Clara stood unyielding, a woman carved from stone and fire, fiercely guarding a heart that no man had yet dared to claim. They called her too fierce to love, a reputation born not of spite, but of survival. For who could bond with a soul forged in relentless independence and hardened by whispered scorn? Yet, as the sun dipped behind jagged mesas, a shadow stirred on the outskirts of her isolated town, a figure whose arrival would shatter the brittle calm and awaken a storm no one foresaw. The town itself was a ragged collection of weather-beaten wooden structures, clinging desperately to the barren earth. Wind-rattled signs creaked above saloons and general stores, while the scent of wood smoke mingled with dry dust in the air. Clara's homestead sat just beyond the last cluster of homes, a fortress in solitude, surrounded by a patchwork of thorny brush and parched soil. Here, amid the howling winds and watchful silence, she tended her land with a vigilant hand, ever wary of the threats, both seen and whispered, that prowled the borders of her carefully controlled existence. Clara, with eyes as sharp and untamed as the desert hawk, moved with a purpose that brooked no interruption. Her reputation was as much armor as her worn leather jacket and the rifle slung over her shoulder. To the wary townsfolk, she was an enigma, equal parts legend and warning. Yet beneath the steely veneer lay scars carved by isolation and battles fought in quiet desperation. She had learned to stand alone, weaving defiance into every fiber of her being. That evening, a murmur rippled through the dusty streets when the figure stepped into view. Kalen, a warrior from the Apache tribes, whose name echoed like a whispered threat carried on the wind. Clad in the earth's own colors, his presence stirred the air with an undeniable gravity, a palpable tension that made the hair rise on the backs of those who dared to meet his gaze. His past was a shadowy tapestry, tales of relentless pursuit, survival against impossible odds, and a silent code etched into the sinews of his being. The townspeople shuffled nervously, eyes darting between Kalen and Clara, doubt and fear etching their features. Here were two forces of nature, equally fierce, equally alone. The first encounter between Clara and Kalen crackled with silent challenge, each woman's and man's gaze sizing up the other, a wariness born not just of cultural divide, but of the shared scars of mistrust and survival. Neither offered the warmth of friendship, yet neither could ignore the electric pulse of recognition in that tension. The town's unease grew as whispers turned to wary glances. Something dark lurked nearby, ready to unfold. Suddenly, the tranquility shattered. A band of ruthless outlaws, the sort that thrived on chaos and bloodshed, descended upon the town like a ravenous storm. Shouts ripped through the evening air, gunfire sparked against wooden walls, and the scent of smoke and sweat mingled thickly beneath the roiling sky. Clara moved swiftly, her every step a testament to years of hard-earned skill and survival instinct. Beside her, Kalen's strikes were like lightning, precise and deadly, each motion a dance of battle-honed grace. Together, they became an unyielding bulwark against the chaos, their distrust dissolved in the heat of fight for survival. When silence finally reclaimed the night, broken only by heavy breaths and distant echoes of fleeing boots, Kaelin stepped closer to Clara. For the first time, her fierce walls faltered. A man who met her defiance with quiet strength, who challenged her solitude without fear. In that charged moment, something fragile and inexplicably new ignited. A seed planted in hardened ground beneath the stars. Muitos companheiros de jornada que acompanham nossas lendas por estas terras esquecidas nos contaram que o destino, ou o algoritmo traiçoeiro do YouTube, às vezes desfaz suas inscrições sem aviso. Antes que a próxima trilha perigosa se revele e uma nova reviravolta aconteça, dê uma espiada rápida aí embaixo do vídeo e garanta que você ainda está inscrito em nosso bando para não perder o fio da meada. Não queremos que você perca nenhuma das vozes que ecoam deste vale. Verifique sua inscrição agora e junte-se à nossa saga. The mornings in the town were always heavy with suspicion, but now those whispers carried a sharper edge. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun's first light painted the barren earth in muted gold. Yet the weight pressing on her shoulders was no less than the long shadows cast by the distant mesas. Kaelin's presence by her side, once a silent challenge, had become a quiet yet undeniable magnetism, stirring something unfamiliar beneath the layers she had built so carefully. But both knew that the town's wary gazes were not idle. They marked the beginning of a storm far beyond. Whispered words. Their conversations were brief and measured, like the deliberate tapping of a gunmetal blade on weathered wood. Each word exacting, each silence dense with meaning. Clara found herself caught between curiosity and caution. The warrior's eyes held secrets deeper than the canyons and scars earned in battles she dared not name. Kaelin, too, wrestled with ghosts carved by blood and betrayal, wary to let anything into that hardened fortress. They skirted the edge of connection, like two coyotes circling over fresh bones, drawn by necessity, yet guarded by old wounds. Outside the fragile bubble of their tentative alliance, the town simmered with a growing unease. The merchants and ranchers, a tangled knot of pride and prejudice, saw Kaelin as an intrusion, a shadow threatening to unravel the fragile balance they clung to. A clandestine meeting convened. Under the fading light, men whose faces bore the dust of countless dry seasons, eyes sharp and cold. They whispered of solidarity, of unrest stirred by a stranger who even the sheriff refused to fully trust. Their plan was a dark thread weaving through the night. Kaelin must be pushed out, by force if necessary. Clara, ever vigilant, caught the shifting glances and hushed tones, but she remained silent, stepping carefully through the minefield of innuendo. Yet one night, beneath the brittle gleam of a slivered moon, the threat came to her doorstep. A crude note, hastily scrawled and threatening, slid under her door like a serpent's whisper. Cut ties with the Apache. The words burned with venom, a stark order lined with warning. Clara's jaw tightened. For the first time, the wrath of the town sought to strike not just at Kaelin, but directly at her, the fierce woman no one dared to love. The gamble was clear. Her alliance with Kaelin had ruptured an unseen boundary, and now the fragile peace teetered on the edge of ruin. That night, Clara sat by the flicker of her hearth, the letter folded neatly in her palm, its bite lingering like a venom she refused to let poison her resolve. Outside, the desert wind howled its mournful song, but inside, the silence pressed heavier than the dark. She thought of Kalen's steady presence, the warrior whose scars mirrored her own battles, who had challenged her solitude with fierce quietude. When dawn crept over the skyline, Clara sought out Kalen, finding him shadowed beneath the ancient juniper tree that marked the northern edge of town. His gaze met hers, a storm contained within somber eyes. Neither spoke of the threats or the seething discontent beyond their world, but their shared understanding needed no words. The lines etched on Kalen's face deepened, a silent vow forged in the heat of conviction. Time seemed to contract and stretch in those moments. The town watched, jaws tightened and whispers sharpened, but Clara and Kalen stood like twin pillars defying the gathering tempest. Yet beneath their defiance lurked unease. Each knew the path ahead was fraught with peril, the enmity simmering like dry tinder ready to ignite. The rival faction was relentless, and the message had been made unmistakably clear. The warrior must be cast out before his influence spread beyond the shadows. At the general store, locals exchanged wary glances. Doors remained guarded, and trust frayed like worn leather. Clara's alliances, once solitary and unyielding, now intertwined with Kalen's fate, and through that bond, with the fate of a town fracturing at its core. The wind carried a new scent, the acrid sting of bitter divides, the promise of rupture. That afternoon, as Clara returned to her homestead, a figure stepped from the brush, rough hands gripping a lantern, eyes glinting with malice. The threat had edged closer. The town was no longer a safe refuge. The hatred had become a tangible hunt. She met the dark gaze without flinching, her voice low and steady as the desert stone. "Tell them I won't break." Her defiance set like iron, but inside the walls of her soul, a war waged between the steel of her independence and the fragile stirrings of an unexpected hope. Kalen, upon seeing the fire burning yet resilient in her eyes, let slip a rare small smile, a ghost of softening behind impenetrable armor. Together, they understood their fight was no longer just against the land's harshness or the outlaws at the border, but against a deeper, more insidious resistance, one born of fear, ignorance, and old grudges. In that moment, they sealed a silent pact, a shared shield against the gathering storm. The night creeping closer, Clara's thoughts darkened with unease as the letter's words echoed still. She knew the peace was fragile, on the edge of a knife. The next step would mean crossing a line the town dared not openly mention, but whispered in every furious glance and hesitant step. As stars began to prick the waning light, a shadow detached itself from the darkness, a messenger, breathless and urgent. In hushed tones, words spilled that pulled the scab off the festering wound in the town's uneasy calm. "They want you to stop, or else." The threat was never just to Kalen anymore. It was to Clara's very heart, her defiance, her claim to the land and the man who had begun to carve his place beside her. That night, the quiet was the loudest danger yet. The town, their town, stood on the brink, and in the gathering shadows, Clara clenched her fists and bit back fear. The fight had only just begun. Taina appeared like a shadow, slipping through the brittle morning light, her gait steady and assured, carrying the weight of command and unspoken warnings. The wind bit sharp as it swept across the cracked earth, carrying hints of coming storms, both in the sky and in human hearts. Clara watched her approach from the porch, the distant echo of the tribe's fierce legacy reverberating in the tension coiling beneath Taina's grave expression. Kalen's sister was a striking figure, eyes dark and unreadable as desert stones, lips pressed tight with purpose. No softness softened her features. In her presence, Clara felt the first chill of vulnerability flicker beneath the defiant fire she had long nurtured. Taina's words came low, edged with iron. "There is a war coming," Taina said, voice steady but cold. "Between our people and the settlers, stoked by those who would see us erased. Your town's tolerance is fragile. They watch my brother and you with suspicion and hatred. It won't last." Clara's jaw twitched, her fingers tightening on the rough wood railing beneath her. The news was no surprise. Rumors had stirred in whispers. But hearing it from a tribal leader, from Kalen's own blood, made it undeniable, pressing. "I don't want war," Clara said finally, voice steady, even as unease bled into her bones. "Neither do I want to lose what we might have built here, or him." Taina's eyes flickered briefly, calculating, wary, but it was clear she was not here to offer comfort. "This is not your world, Clara. It never will be. Kalen is torn, his heart pulled between the blood of his people and the man he is becoming here. Both sides will demand everything." Clara's silence spoke volumes, the reality of the pull between lands and loyalties slicing through her pride. The tension between the two women rose, heavy as the desert sun, until the brittle air shattered with a sudden crack, thick smoke curling beyond the tree line, a harsh scent of burning flesh and dry brush clawing at their senses. Clara's heart hammered. Her gaze snapped to the horizon, just as a dark plume unfurled against the sky. Flames licked hungrily through the outskirts of the homestead, her homestead. Without a word, Clara dashed forward, every step fueled by raw terror and fierce protectiveness, Taina following close behind, their breaths ragged in the turbulent air. The fire roared with unnatural hunger, devouring the dry wood and brittle grass like a living thing set loose with malice. Clara's hands trembled as she fought against the blaze, dousing smoldering embers with the scant water she could muster. The destruction felt personal, a deliberate wound carved into the fragile union she was striving to build. Taina watched coldly, eyes sharp as the fire's dance. They're uneasy. Alliance fracturing under the weight of this violent provocation. "This was no accident," Clara said through clenched teeth. "Someone wants us torn apart." Taina's expression darkened, confirming what Clara dreaded. The flames were kindling for a war neither of them wanted, but one they were now forced to face. Around the town, whispers swelled into murmurs, fear seeping into bone, planting seeds of suspicion and rage. Clara's neighbors watched from shuttered windows, eyes alight with dread and accusation, their silence heavier than any words. The fragile buffer between peace and chaos was crumbling. Clara stood among the ashes of her burning land, the smoke clouding her vision. But her resolve sharpened. The fire had been meant to isolate her, to punish her alliance, to break her spirit. Instead, it forged it anew. The woman known as Too Fierce, Too Love, felt the walls she'd built give way, not in surrender, but in begrudging acceptance of an incendiary bond that might yet blaze with a different fire. As sunset bled gold into crimson, Clara and Taina faced each other amid the smoldering ruins. Their breaths mingling in the middle of a silent war, neither was ready to fight, yet forced to prepare. Outside, the desert wind whispered secrets of vengeance and survival, carrying a message that would rip through the fragile peace of the town. Fire only consumes when fanned, and someone was holding the flames close. That night, beneath a bruised sky, Clara caught the scent of smoke trailing beyond the horizon, the promise of more than just burned fields. As she closed the door on the ruins of all she'd fought for, a single thought burned sharper than the fire's embers. This was only the beginning. The night clung to the rugged edges of the town like a thick cloak, the embers from Clara's scorched homestead still flickering faintly beneath the relentless desert stars. The acrid scent of charred wood lingered heavy in the air, haunting every breath. Kalen's dark eyes cut through the shadows, sharp with determination, as he and Clara stood side by side, their faces etched with the weight of betrayal and rising fury. The fire was no accident. It was a message, an act of calculated cruelty meant to unravel fragile threads before they could weave a stronger bond. "I won't let this break us," Clara said, her voice tight, threading the heavy silence between them. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into palms, grounding her fierce resolve. "They want fear. They want me to turn away, to forget who I am, what I've fought for." Kalen's jaw tightened. "And they'll fail." His voice was low, but absolute, unwavering as the stone beneath their boots. "We've survived worse, together." But survival demanded more than defiance. It demanded answers. Their alliance, once a quiet circle of shared respect, was now a front line in a brewing war. The town was fracturing, torn by whispers and hostile glances. The farmers and merchants, restless and resentful, had started arming themselves with venom as sharp as their rifles. Kalen's presence, like a shadow cast over the sun, was stirring a fury that threatened to consume everyone. Who would do this? Clara's eyes searched the dim outline of streets, houses shuttered and silent, as if holding their breath. Who's behind it? Kalen's gaze darkened, recalling secret meetings he knew were taking shape in the corners of the town's saloons and back rooms. The faction, led by that man with the scarred face and cold eyes, his name is Jensen, a man who'd rather see blood spilled than bridges built. Clara's heart clenched at the thought of the betrayal so close to home. Neighbors turned enemies in the shadow of greed and fear. And the mercenaries? Funded by Jensen. Kalen answered grimly, "They're the wolves among us." The wind shifted, carrying with it a distant rustle. Footsteps, hurried, cautious. Taina emerged from the dark, sharp and statuesque against the smoke-darkened sky. Her eyes, oceans of ancient strength, studied the ruined homestead, then fixed intensely on Clara. "This fire, it is the spark for the war that's to come," Taina said, voice steady as a mountain stream, yet heavy with warning. It was set to sever the fragile peace, to ignite hatred in the hearts of men too quick to burn what they don't understand. Clara nodded, the fire's heat still biting at her skin, a sting mirrored in her chest. "I never wanted this. I only wanted to protect what we could build. Us, this town. But now," her voice faltered for the smallest moment before regaining force. "Now I see we're marked." Taina's gaze softened for a beat, the sister soldier within betraying a flicker of empathy. "You carry wounds old as the earth itself. Loss, betrayal, but strength too. Like Kalen." Kalen stepped forward, the lines of battle and survival etched deep into his face. "We're bound by more than blood or land now. Our fight is for what still breathes between these broken souls: hope." Clara shared a long look with him, the flicker of something fragile yet fierce lighting in her eyes. She hesitated, then lowered her voice into a raw confession. "There's something I've never told you. Why I let no one in. Why my heart became this fortress." She drew a shaky breath, memories scraping the edges of her spirit. "A man I trusted, he broke everything. Left me with scars deeper than these flames." Kalen listened without interruption, the only sound the distant call of a coyote mourning the night. When she finished, heavy silence pressed between them. Then he spoke, voice layered with rumble and rare softness. "I carry my own ghosts, battles lost, brothers fallen, a past steeped in blood and regret. I never thought to find something worth fighting for beyond survival." Their confessions knitted a fragile thread of understanding, binding them closer amid the roiling storm outside. Until now, their fierce facades had kept distance, but in this shared space, they glimpsed the possibility of something beyond wariness: trust, maybe even hope. The night deepened, but they were not alone. Eyes watched from shadowed doorways, silent accusations, and curiosity tangled thickly in the stagnant air. The town's division was no longer subtle, but raw and bleeding, wounds exposed for all to see. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind a weathered barn. The lantern's flickering flame revealed a messenger, breathless, urgency carved into every line of his face. "They have proof," the man gasped, voice sharp with alarm. "Jensen isn't just stirring hatred. He's financing mercenaries to drive every Apache from the land, including Kalen's tribe." Kalen's expression hardened, a cold fire igniting deep within his eyes. "They want us erased." Clara's fingers curled into the fabric of her coat, knuckles white as the weight of this revelation settled between them. The fight was no longer just for her farm or even the town. It was for survival itself, the survival of a people, of a bond forged in defiance of a world that sought to tear them apart. And, the messenger added, voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "The plan is moving faster than anyone feared. They're striking soon." A charged silence cracked open like lightning, the urgency pulsing through every heartbeat. Clara turned to Kalen, their eyes locking, unspoken resolve sparking between them. They stood as the weight of the desert night pressed in, united against a storm gathering on every horizon. The fight was no longer distant. It was here, looming and relentless. The night was thick with tension as Clara and Kaelin stood face to face, the weight of the gathering storm pressing down on them both. Tyna's words echoed in Clara's mind, the inevitability of war casting a long shadow over the fragile bonds forming between Apache and settler. Kaelin's sister was not one to squander warnings, and the urgency in her voice had left no room for hope that peace might hold. Outside, the wind whispered an ominous warning, carrying the faint rustle of dry brush and distant, uneasy noises that marked the restless desert night. Clara's gaze was fixed beyond the horizon, where the darkening sky hid the first tendrils of smoke, curling and twisting like a living thing. Her breath hitched as the scent of fire sank into the parched air, a cruel omen that sent a shudder through her spine. Then the flames revealed themselves, licking hungrily against the edges of her homestead. The fire's roar shattered the suffocating silence, a fierce and malevolent blaze that devoured the brittle remnants of brush and dry wood. Clara's chest tightened with primal fear, a helplessness long unfamiliar, tightening its grip over her heart. This was no accident, no random calamity. The act was a deliberate knife plunged into the fragile hope she had dared to nurture. Without waiting for words, she raced toward the flames, her boots kicking up dust that seemed to choke with acrid smoke. Kaelin followed, his steady steps a counterpoint to the chaos erupting around them. Tyna's presence was a silent force behind them, an unflinching sentinel. Confronting the blaze alongside the woman marked too fierce to love. Clara's hands trembled, but did not falter, as she hauled buckets of water from the well, dousing the scorching embers with what little she could muster. The fire snapped and hissed, stubborn as the defiance burning inside her. Each flicker of flame felt like a challenge directed squarely at her, a message meant to isolate her from the man now entwined with her fate. This was meant to tear us apart, Clara said through gritted teeth, voice raw but resolute. To set a fire between us, so wide no bridge could survive. Tyna's eyes narrowed, fierce as a desert hawk's. A war is coming. This flame is only the beginning. The ones behind this want hatred to explode in hearts too quick to surrender to. Fear. The echoes of threatened violence stirred across the town, rustling behind shuttered windows and whispered in guarded conversations. The fragile truce that had held between settler and native was fracturing beneath the weight of old grudges and new fears. Clara felt the isolation deepen. Neighbors once indifferent now regarded her with wary, accusing eyes. Back at the edge of the fire's aftermath, Clara squared her shoulders. The embers, still warm beneath her fingertips, but no longer burning through her resolve. The scorched earth smelled of loss, yes, but also of the fierce determination that would not yield. Kaelin's voice was steady beside her as he spoke with quiet certainty. They chose this fight, but they will not win it while we stand together. Their alliance had shifted from tentative respect to shared purpose. Their once guarded interactions, softening beneath the pressure of survival and the unbearable weight of understanding. Clara found herself daring to hope, not for peace perhaps, but for the strength to weather the fury to come. Later, under the bruised sky, where stars fought to pierce thick clouds of smoke, Taina gathered them in a tense council. Her voice steeled the moment. We must prepare. The man behind this, Jensen, rallies others. His hatred stretches wide. Farmers, merchants, mercenaries who answer only to coin and cruelty. Clara swallowed the bitter truth, the knowledge settling like dust in every crevice of her heart. She was no longer a lone woman on her land. She was a beacon targeted by those who feared change. An invitation followed, a summons to a meeting with the town's leadership, where the stakes would be laid bare, and Clara would stand at the eye of the gathering storm. The once solitary realm she had commanded was now a battleground for souls, law, and survival. The next day, clad in her worn leather jacket, Clara entered the creaking town hall. The murmur of the crowd hit her like a physical weight. Faces unfamiliar or hard, eyes blazing with suspicion or thinly veiled disdain. The room breathed tension, thick as the desert heat at noon, and Clara felt its weight settle on her shoulders, heavier than any rifle. Voices rose, sharp and pointed. Accusations of betrayal stung the air, directed at her with savage precision. She was called a traitor, a threat masquerading as a settler, a woman seduced by the Apache, too fierce to be trusted and too dangerous to be left unchecked. Clara stood rigid, the laughter and murmurs ebbing and flowing like ill winds through cracked windows. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm, but her face remained an unyielding mask of strength. The humiliation was a dagger thrust deep, severing the tentative trust she had reached for so carefully. At the edges of the crowd, Kalen watched, every muscle taut, eyes burning with quiet fury. His loyalty to Clara was an unspoken roar beneath his cool exterior, a protector caught in the crossfire of a town tearing itself apart. As Clara's name was spat by voices that once acknowledged only her fierce independence, a sigh escaped her lips, a breath tangled with rage, sorrow, and a stubborn refusal to fall. When the meeting adjourned, the walls seemed to close tighter around her. The sanctuary of solitude turned into a prison of suspicion. Her land, once refuge, felt colder, less hers than ever before. Yet, the fire that daylight had sparked in Clara's spirit could not be quenched by words or scorn. Kalen approached her as the murmurs dwindled, his steps deliberate and resolute. Their eyes met, pools of shared pain and simmering defiance. The weight of ostracism bore down hard, but within it lay an unyielding truth. They stood not as isolated souls, but as a force stubbornly linked, bound by a dangerous love defying the storm. And in that charged stillness, the town's fractured heart beat around them, unaware of the fierce bond quietly forging beneath the ashes of betrayal and the rising smoke of war. The sun had barely crept above the horizon when Clara sensed the crushing weight of solitude settle again around her like a second skin. Her heart, still raw from the sharpened edges of public humiliation, ached with a lonely ache that even the vast expanse of desert seemed unable to ease. The cold taste of rejection lingered in the morning air, a bitter reminder that the fragile veil of acceptance she had fought so hard to weave had been torn brutally away. Kaelin's presence felt distant now, even though he stood quietly at her side, beneath the skeletal limbs of the dying juniper trees. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, silent and watchful, like a lone sentinel guarding a border no one dared cross. The man who had dared to breach her defenses was now her only anchor in a world that sought to cast them both out, heavily wounded in spirit, and, at the same time, fiercely determined. "We can't stay," Kaelin said finally, his voice low and rough as gravel. "Not here, not while the town turns against us. Every step forward is met with another stone thrown in our path." His eyes searched hers, burning with the weight of a hard truth that even the desert wind could not carry away. "There's a place beyond these lands, my people's land, safe and hidden. We can find peace there, start anew." Clara swallowed the lump that threatened to choke her, her fingers clenched into the worn leather of her coat as the scorching memory of betrayal twisted like a knife in her gut. To run now, would that be surrender or survival? "I won't abandon this place," she whispered, voice brittle yet defiant. "Not yet." But even as the words left her lips, the wall she'd built around her heart began to crumble under the weight of everything she'd endured. The whispers in the town, the accusations, the fire that had nearly destroyed her, none of it promised a future. Only emptiness trailed behind the fading echoes of hope. Kaelin's hand found hers, rough and steady, a silent pact forged in the dim light of dawn. "Together, then," he said. "Flee with me before they tighten the noose. We ride for tomorrow, not yesterday." No room was left for doubt in his eyes, and Clara couldn't deny the pull of that fierce fire, whatever it was, smoldering between them. Morning bled into a restless day, and under a sky mottled with bruised clouds, they packed what little they could carry. The horizon stretched wide and merciless, the earth dry and cracked beneath their heavy boots. Their footsteps kicked up dust that lingered like ghosts in the air, as they moved swiftly, away from the stifling weight of a town that had turned hostile. Every moment was tense. Every sound could be the rustling herald of danger. Kaelin's senses were sharp, his instincts honed by years surviving on the razor's edge between life and death. Still, Clara's determination burned hot beside him, a blazing shield against despair. Her fierce heart pulsed with a purpose larger than herself. The journey was slow, shadows long and menacing as the sun dipped low. They traveled through broken land, where dry creek beds cracked open like wounds in the earth, and thorny brush clawed at their clothes with cruel indifference. The quiet was a fragile thing, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind threading between the worn leather and whispered prayers to spirits long forgotten. But as night embraced the desert, danger caught them unprepared. From the darkness, shapes materialized like specters, a band of mercenaries, eyes cold and cruel, armed and merciless. They had been tracking the desperate flight of the woman and the Apache warrior, sent by the man named Jensen, whose thirst for vengeance was as deep as the scar that bisected his grim face. The ambush was swift and brutal. Shots rang out, echoing across the night sky like hell's fury unleashed. Kalen threw himself forward, shouting a warning as bullets tore through the air. The crack of gunfire mingled with the dry earth's scream and Clara's gasp of shock and fear. She ducked behind a jagged boulder, heart pounding as she tried to steady her breath. Kalen did not falter. But even as he fought with savage precision, a searing pain flared in his side, a wound that slowed him, that drained his strength even as the fight raged on. His breath came hard, blood darkening his shirt beneath the moonlight. Clara saw it. Time fractured. Her fierce independence shattered into sharp shards as she darted toward him. Shouting his name through the frenzy of violence, she reached him just as he collapsed against the ground, his body trembling, his face etched with pain and determination. "Hold on," she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. "Please, hold on." But before she could breathe relief, heavy hands grabbed her. From behind, rough, iron grips closed around her arms, dragging her backward into the shadows of the mercenaries' cruel grip. Her protests were swallowed by the chaos as the bandits bound her wrists, their eyes glittering with ruthless satisfaction. Kalen's breath hitched, helpless, his voice ragged with despair as he watched the woman who had defied the frontier beside him become a prisoner. In the suffocating dark, Clara's ears caught whispers, harsh murmurs of a plan unfolding beyond her cell. The Apache tribe, Kalen's people, were under attack at the same time. The villains aimed not just to break them as individuals, but to erase the presence of Apache from these lands entirely. A chill swept over her, not just the cold stone against her skin, but the cold certainty that the storm had come. The war was no longer just a threat on the horizon. It was here, raging with the fury of 1,000 suns. And in that suffocating silence, Clara understood. Their fight had only just begun. The dawn crept over the horizon with a fragile light, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape where Kalen lay, wounded and alone. Pain radiated from his side, sharp and searing, but it was the ache deeper in his spirit that gnawed the hardest. The absence of Clara. His mind drifted through the haze of agony, unraveling the last moments before he lost consciousness. The mercenaries' sudden ambush, the stinging crack of gunfire, and the last glimpse of Clara, pulled away into darkness. Slowly, his eyelids fluttered open to the dim, muted glow of dawn, filtering through the dense canopy of the tribal camp. He was surrounded by the steady hum of life, a mix of whispered prayers, soft footsteps on dry earth, and the faint murmur of voices speaking in the old tongue. Relief mingled with urgency, stirred in his chest. He was home, but not unscathed. Despite the throbbing pain, Kalen forced himself upright. Each movement was a trial, but the resolve hardening in his gaze burned brighter than any wound. Clara was out there, captive, and he would find her. The shadows pressing down on him were nothing compared to the storm gathering in his soul. He would gather the warriors, rally his kin, and bring her back. No wound could weaken the promise he carried, to save her, and to end the violence that threatened to consume them all. Meanwhile, within the cold, unyielding walls of the mercenaries' makeshift prison, Clara sat in the darkness, her wrists bound, but her spirit fiercely unbroken. The rough stones beneath her offered no comfort, yet she clung to the flame inside her heart, the same fierce fire that had earned her the town's wary nickname. Around her, shadows flickered at the edges of flickering lantern light. The jailers spoke in low, gruff tones, their cruelty etched into every harsh glance. But Clara remained silent, listening, waiting for an opening. Their taunts fell like stones against an iron wall. She refused to bend, to show fear. Instead, her eyes scanned the figures around her. Men hardened by greed, suspicion, and hatred, but men who were not invincible. Within the darkness of her captivity, Clara began weaving a delicate game of influence. Subtle words to test loyalties, gestures to plant seeds of doubt, or perhaps unexpected alliance. She was a fortress here too, but one with cunning, not just steel. Hours stretched and twisted, and murmurs reached her ears, snatches of information borne on careless tongues. One voice, louder than the rest, spoke of a plan. One cloaked in danger, but speaking of hope. A daring rescue, desperate and perilous, yet the best chance to break the mercenaries' grip. A whispered name surfaced, a hint of a schedule. Movements that could be exploited, and perhaps an ally hidden within the enemy's own ranks. Clara's heart quickened. The fire that sought to extinguish her had only forged a sharper will. She held fast to this sliver of promise, a spark of light in the unrelenting night. Days passed in painful stillness, until Kalen, steady despite his wound, rallied his tribe's fiercest warriors. Their loyalty was his armor, their spirits a tide rising to meet the gathering tempest. Their eyes, fierce and determined, knew the cost of survival and the price of failure. Each warrior bore their own scars, woven into the fabric of ancient grievances and unyielding hope. Led by Kalen's quiet strength, the tribal band moved like shadows under the cloak of dusk. Every footstep was careful, every breath measured. The land that had nurtured and shaped them now witnessed their desperate charge toward a single goal: to reclaim what had been stolen, to rescue the woman who had come to be more than just a stranger from the settler's world. But even as they crept nearer the mercenaries' stronghold, tension coiled like a rattlesnake, ready to strike. The enemy was cunning, their numbers bolstered by hired guns and embittered men thirsty for vengeance. Every step into the dark heart of enemy-controlled terrain was a gamble, a dance on the edge of ruin and salvation. In the cold shadows, Clara waited, her thoughts a tempest of fear and resolve. She imagined Kalen's approach, his grim determination, and the unspoken trust that bound them together. The walls around her prison were thick, but not thick enough for her spirit to be contained. When night deepened and silence settled like a blanket, an unexpected figure slipped into her cell, a man whose eyes held flickers of remorse or perhaps rebellion. His whispered words cut through the stillness. A rescue was coming, swift and dangerous, but their best hope. Yet the danger was colossal. Failure was unthinkable. Clara's pulse thundered with every whispered detail. The plan, the timing, the risk. It was one chance, razor-thin and sharp. If it failed, not only would freedom slip away, but the fragile bond between her and Kalen, the hope for peace between two worlds, might be shattered forever. The prison air seemed to constrict around her, suffused with the weight of looming explosion. Somewhere beyond the walls, the fires of war were ready to be stoked, threats converging from every side. And Clara, though captive, was not defeated. The fierce woman who had survived betrayal, loss, and scorn would not surrender. Not now. Not ever. Outside, Kalen's warriors readied themselves, their faces set in grim lines reflecting battles lost and futures fiercely sought. They were a force born from the earth itself, unyielding, relentless. The time had come to strike back. But as the first arrows were loosed, and the camp roared to life in a clash of fury and desperation, Clara's sharp ears caught a whisper borne on the wind. The war against the Apache tribe was not confined to the battlefield, but had spread like wildfire. Their enemies sought to eradicate the Apache presence from the region entirely. And in that fractured dark, with gunfire and cries echoing like thunder, Clara understood the brutal truth. The coming days would demand more than courage. They would demand sacrifice. The storm was upon them. The night still clung to the town when the first murmurs of movement stirred beneath the fading stars. Kalen stood silently by the edge of the encampment, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The wound in his side throbbed steadily, a relentless reminder of the mercenaries' brutal ambush. Yet his spirit burned fiercer still. Around him, the resolute faces of his fellow warriors gathered, their dark eyes reflecting the solemn weight of the mission ahead. "This is not just to save Clara," Kalen said, voice low but carrying through the quiet. "It is to protect our people, our future. We cannot let their hatred erase us from these lands." The warriors nodded as one, a silent pact forged in the chill desert air. With deliberate steps, they prepared their weapons, the faint clink of metal against leather, a grim symphony for the task to come. Every soul there bore scars, some visible, others etched deep within. But tonight, those wounds gave way to a fierce unity. Meanwhile, beyond the walls of the mercenaries' grim stronghold, Clara sat in the darkness, wrists bound but eyes unyielding. The rough-hewn stone and flickering shadows offered no comfort. Yet she clung tight to the embers of her spirit. Every breath she took was deliberate, every heartbeat echoing the fierce defiance that had earned her the cruel epithet, too fierce to love. Defiance now sharpened by the cold chains of captivity. Her captors spoke among themselves, their harsh whispers carrying words thick with greed and cruelty. Yet Clara remained still, listening, searching for the slightest crack, the faintest sign of opportunity. Slowly, she began to weave a delicate web of subtle exchanges, careful glances, and half-words, probing for a spark of doubt or rebellion hidden in the hearts of these men. Hours crawled by in the suffocating silence, until a shadow moved quietly toward her, a figure hastily shrouded in the lantern's dim glow. The man's voice was rough, carrying a mixture of fear and something that might just be sympathy. "They're coming," he whispered urgently. "Kalen and his warriors. A rescue. Risky, yes, but our only chance." Clara's pulse surged. Against the weight of encroaching darkness, this fragile whisper was a lifeline. Hope wrapped in danger, razor-thin but real. She nodded minutely, steeling herself for the storm about to break. As the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, Kalen ignored the dull ache pulsing through his body. Each step closer to the mercenary's stronghold was a step toward Clara, the woman who had broken through his armor without a word, who had taught him there could be more than survival to fight for. Pain was a distant shadow compared to the fire raging in his chest. His warriors moved, like ghosts over the cracked earth, blending with the parched landscape as if grown from its very bones. The tension was a taut wire. One false move could shatter everything. Yet their resolve was absolute. Back inside, Clara's senses sharpened in the cold gloom. Every creak of the floorboards, every careless word from the guards, became a thread to unravel. She barely dared to breathe as she clung to the promise whispered to her, a plan born from desperation and courage. Outside, the desert air rippled with anticipation as Kalen's warriors closed ranks. The moment had come to strike and to seize the fragile thread of freedom before it snapped in the jaws of fear. Suddenly, the heaviness of the night shattered. A surge of movement lit by torches, the crack of weapons drawn, a chorus of shouted orders exploding into the silent dawn. Arrows whistled and struck. Gunfire cracked, sharp as flint, igniting tinder. The mercenaries scrambled, caught by the fierce and sudden onslaught. Within the prison, chaos erupted. Clara ducked low, heart hammering as she maneuvered through the turmoil. Her eyes sought Kalen's, and when their gazes locked amidst the fury, something unspoken surged between them, a mingling of relief, fierce hope, and renewed strength. But even as they fought side by side, a deeper threat loomed. From the shadows of the land, word had come. Jensen's campaign was not just a vendetta against one man or woman. It was a war on Kalen's tribe itself. The Apache were targeted for elimination, their very existence under siege. The battle cries echoed, but beneath the violence surfaced a more terrible truth. The war was spreading. Clara's breath caught, the weight of this revelation pressing like stone in her chest. This was no longer a fight for survival alone. It was a fight for identity, for legacy. Their enemy's cruelty sought total erasure. As gunfire tore through the morning air, the piercing wails of warriors and settlers alike mingled with the crackling flames of burning brush farther beyond. Clara, raw in spirit yet unbroken, stood with Kalen amid the maelstrom. The fight was no longer on the horizon. It was here, and it would demand everything they had. Night still held the desert in its cold grasp as Clara's breath mingled with the sharp air. Her wrists bruised and bound, she crouched low in the dim cell, every faint noise a drumbeat against her fierce resolve. Outside, the distant clash of steel and gunfire rent the dawn's fragile silence. Kalen's warriors had come. Her heart pounded, a wild rhythm echoing the promise of the whispered rescue. The man from inside had risked everything to tell her. Hope was near, but peril even closer. She steadied herself against the cold stone, every pulse a testament to battles fought before, with gun, with grief, and now with chains that could not imprison the fire within. Suddenly, the cell door flung open, torches searing the shadows. Warriors swarmed in, Kalen at their head, his expression raw but resolute despite the blood seeping through his worn shirt. Their eyes locked. In that fierce exchange, unspoken words passed, a vow steeled in months of war and guarded hope. Their escape was a blur of desperate movement. Clara, freed but still trembling, leaned on Kalen's strong arm. Every step away from the grim fortress toward freedom was stained with the screams of battle and the acrid scent of smoldering earth. Yet, even as their survival flickered to life, the real war awaited beyond the horizon. The ravaged landscape bore silent witness to the storm unleashed. Flames burned through dry brush miles away. Jensen's vendetta was a campaign to cleanse the land of Apache presence altogether. The mercenaries' brutality was no mere act of cruelty. It was a calculated purge. Kalen grimaced, clutching the wound in his side, even as his gaze sharpened. They want to erase us, not just from the land, but from memory, he said, voice hoarse. Clara met his gaze, her fierce spirit unbowed. Then we fight, not just for us, but for everyone who will follow. Her words hung, heavy between them, a call to arms wrapped in iron and hope. The warriors rallied, an unbroken circle of defiance against the rising tide of hatred. Tana stood among them, unflinching, her presence a beacon of the tribe's enduring strength. "This is our moment," she said quietly, "to show that love and courage can outmatch fear and destruction." Together they moved, a living storm converging on the mercenaries' lair, hearts beating in fierce rhythm. Clara's voice carried over the charged air, sharp as the crack of a rifle shot. "For every soul lost, for every wound hidden, this ends now." The final battle erupted beneath a sky heavy with smoky clouds and searing heat. Gunfire and war cries tore through the silence, bodies moving like shadows, entwined in mortal struggle. Amidst the chaos, Clara and Kalen fought side by side, her fire matched by his savage precision. Each moment was a desperate gamble, until at last the tide turned. Jensen, cornered and furious, faced them with rage and venom. But the combined strength of settlers and Apache unified in defiance, shattered his cruel ambitions. He fell broken. The venom of division drained away. Breathing heavily, Clara turned to the battered faces around her. Some were settlers who had chosen courage over fear. Some Apache warriors, unwilling to yield their land or honor. A fragile alliance forged in blood and hope now gleamed like dawn's first light. But even victory bore weight. A stern figure awaited, the local government official, eyes cold and calculating, arrived to wield law as weapon, not for peace, but to enforce division. Clara stepped forward, fierce and unyielding, her voice ringing clear and powerful. We are not pawns to be moved or erased. This land holds all our stories, our battles, our loves, our lives. We demand justice. We demand peace. The room grew heavy with silence before murmurs of assent rippled through the unlikely assembly. The official, confronted with unified resolve, faltered. The iron grip of prejudice met a wall of will forged by union. In the aftermath, the frontier community began to shift. Walls of suspicion cracked as newcomers and old-timers learned the language of respect and coexistence. Clara's name, once whispered with warning, now carried the weight of legend. The woman too fierce to love, who dared to love fiercely, and by doing so, carved a path to peace. At twilight, Clara and Kaylin stood upon the ridge overlooking the valley below. The land stretched wide, scarred yet alive, with new shoots of green pushing through the cracked earth. The sun bled warm gold across the sky. Kaylin reached for Clara's hand, rough fingers closing around hers with tender certainty. We survive the fire and the fury, but it is this, our bond, that will shape what comes next. Clara's gaze softened. At last, the fortress around her heart had crumbled, replaced by a fierce, unyielding hope. Together, we build what fear tried to burn down. Under the vast frontier sky, two fierce souls stood united, no longer isolated, no longer too fierce to love, but bound by love fierce enough to change the course of their world. The wind whispered through the trees, a promise carried on every breath. From ashes and conflict, a new life would rise, and this time it would endure.